Today on Inside Utah Politics, the stage is set for the primary election. That includes the Republican nomination for governor. We're breaking down the race as it shifts to the next phase with Salt Lake Tribune columnist Robert Gerke. Plus, price gougers are trying to take advantage of fears surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, and that has some calling for new federal standards. We'll take a look at how lawmakers are trying to address it.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. It is no doubt a busy time in Utah politics, and we are breaking it all down with Salt Lake Tribune columnist Robert Gerke. Robert, glad to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here. Always good to have you with us.
Yeah, nice to join you remotely.
Yeah, kind of a different way of doing business these days. Maybe we'll get back to normal, but for now we have a good setup. So let's get right into the race for governor. This is really a fascinating race. Let's start off with convention. Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox and former House Speaker Greg Hughes coming out. What were your thoughts on how convention played out?
Well, I think going in, obviously the big question was, is Greg Hughes going to make it out? And if he does, will Jeff Birmingham or Amy Winder-Newton surprise people and be one of the other two? I wasn't too surprised to see Greg Hughes make it out. He had put all his chips on making it through convention to get to the primary. I think the one thing that sort of surprised me was that Spencer Cox was as strong as he was. If you look at the history of the conventions, typically these conventions have a more conservative slant to them. If you remember when Mitt Romney ran with the same group of delegates, he finished behind Representative Mike Kennedy and then went on to trounce him in the primary. But they tend to skew more conservative. Gary Herbert's had problems there in the past, and so this didn't seem like it was going to be Spencer Cox's wheelhouse necessarily, but he performed very strong, and so I think that shows that he has some support among the conservative wing of the Republicans. I think on the flip side of that, John Huntsman's performance was pretty poor. He didn't put a lot of effort into it. He got the signatures, so he's going through to the primary, as is Thomas Wright. And so, you know, now we've got a four-person race, possibly five. Jan Garbett's still a little up in the air.
Right.
The judge ruled this week that she could try to get the 19,000 signatures. It doesn't look likely that she'll be able to do that. But so it looks like it's going to be shaping up to these four fairly strong, I mean, very viable and credible candidates going into the June primary.
Okay, a couple things real quick. One, on the Garbett issue, yeah, she's going to have like a 90% verification rate, so that's a really steep hill to climb. You mentioned Governor Gary Herbert kind of struggled with delegates back in 2016. That's kind of the ironic thing because he was running with Spencer Cox at that time. But now that you mention it, the stage is set. Given the four candidates we know are going to be on the primary ballot, convention isn't necessarily, in a race like this, a true reflection of what we're going to see in the primary. So how do you assess the race now moving forward?
Yeah, it's a really poor predictor. And in fact, you know, as I mentioned, the Romney race, the Herbert race, both of them finished behind their challenger. John Curtis finished fifth of the the 3rd District Special Election Convention. So it's not a good predictor of how people perform in the primary. The polls seem to indicate that right now it's Spencer Cox and John Huntsman. They kind of move back and forth depending on what poll, what time it's done. The big question mark is, if those two split this moderate vote, does that provide an avenue for Greg Hughes? And with four viable candidates, you could have a winner come out of this with less than 30%, become the next governor. So I think, you know, I think right now Cox and Huntsman are the two strongest, but you could see Greg Hughes or Thomas Wright come up and pick up all that ground between them and make this a very close race. Right now, I would say it probably favors Cox a little bit just because he performed so strong at the convention. But, you know, it's hard to count out Huntsman.
Yeah, and then you try to factor how this convention thing works in, because as you mentioned, the person who has won convention since the implementation of SB 54, in most cases, has not been the primary winner.
And it goes to the fundamental issue that conventions are a pretty poor reflection of the Republican electorate at large. You know, we've seen this going back many years, and it was one of the arguments for getting rid of the conventions in the first place, is that if you want a Republican candidate that represents Republican voters, then let the Republican voters pick that candidate. So the conventions are somewhat of a distortion, I think, of where the Republican mainstream is, but it remains an important piece, certainly for Greg Hughes, who's now going forward to the primary.
Yeah, as I mentioned, this is just a fascinating race, and it's going to be fun to watch to see how it plays out. Let's move on to another very important issue, COVID-19 and its impact here on the state of Utah. You have been covering this closely every single day. Why has it been so important to you to not only keep up on the numbers, but try to graph out what they mean for us on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of fear, obviously, and much of it very valid fear. What I've been trying to do is provide people the data, provide people some visualization, a graph of the data, and then try to explain to them, put it in a little bit of context, because it's hard to know. Are we rising? Are we falling? We see cases going up, but we hear from our elected leaders that things are getting better. So, you know, I've kind of tried to immerse myself in it to some extent, become an expert to the extent I can, and try to avoid, you know, making my own conclusions or extrapolating, but just trying to provide people with some context that maybe calms the fears, lets them understand where we are and where we're going,
Yeah.
and how they need to respond.
And I appreciate your daily graphs and how that has kind of put that into perspective. But I have to be honest with you, I've had some heartburn over some of the models we've seen. It seems like a lot of those have been based on worst case scenarios, and we continue to see that pushed out. So in your view, how should we look at some of these models that we're having put in front of us on a daily basis?
Yeah, we've heard from all the experts that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. I think what the models showed us initially is based on what we had seen in China, what we'd seen in Italy, what we were seeing in other parts of Europe, was that this could have been very, very bad. Fortunately, and we saw it was very, very bad in New York and somewhat on the West Coast. Fortunately, we were a little bit behind the curve in Utah, and so we were able to implement all these safeguards, these restrictions that have been very painful for a lot of people and caused a huge amount of unemployment, but they've also flattened the curve, as the phrase we've heard over and over. And so I think it would be wrong to say that the models were wrong. Had we not done what we did do, models probably would have been a lot closer. The models still, though, show that we're not at the peak yet, and we're still a few weeks away from the peak, and we still have the potential for a significant number of new cases in the coming weeks.
And you made a point of that, though, too, that when you take a look at some of the models and then the decision that our local leaders have to make, you can kind of see how complicated and challenging this can be.
Yeah, I mean, they're making these decisions in a little bit of an information vacuum, because they don't really know. They didn't have, at the time they were making the decisions, the lessons that we've, encountered since then, and they didn't have the adequate testing to really have an idea of where the virus was and how widespread it was. And so they were making these decisions a little bit blind. I think they probably made, frankly, the right decisions in trying to lock things down pretty aggressively and keep a lid on this. And then when you get as more information becomes available, you can start loosening it, as the governor announced that we're going to be doing this week. Yeah.
So the shift now into the stabilization or moderate risk phase, do you think that's the appropriate timing for this?
Well, that's hard to say. As you mentioned, it's a very complicated question. I think they're looking at the right metrics. I think they're looking at the transmission rate, which is down around 1, which means if I get it, I only infect one other person. In Salt Lake County, that I would have infected as many as 6 other people at the beginning of this. It got down to 5 and 4 and 3, and now it's 1 to 1. And at that level, you're going to see a smooth increase in cases, but you're not going to see that big hockey stick curve that we saw or in some of the modeling early on, because it doesn't rip through a population like that. So I think that's an important one. Our hospitalizations are low in Salt Lake County. I heard earlier this week that they had about 52 people in the hospital, which means we've got a lot of room in the hospitals. We've got PPE on the protective equipment that the first responders, those frontline healthcare workers need. So we're in a good situation where we can adapt to this, start backing off a little bit, and then if we see a big spike, which we might, we'll see an increase in cases. That's pretty much guaranteed. Then you can start putting the restrictions back in place as needed. So it's going to be a tightrope act. The governor, I think, had a good analogy when he said it's not flipping a switch, it's a dial. And so we'll turn it up a little, and we can dial it back if we need to.
And he also made a comment about how there's always going to be some type of risk associated with life in making the move to go forward as well.
Yeah, and it's a question of how much risk are people willing to accept. I think, frankly, from my own perspective, I'm going to be a little uncomfortable. I'm still going to be taking the precautions I've been taking. I'm not going to necessarily go rush out and have a dinner at a restaurant, even though I think all of us, after being cooped up, we would like to do that. But I kind of want to give it a little bit of time first. I probably will go get a haircut. I'm overdue for a haircut.
Yeah, you and me both right there. and it shows, no doubt about that. Hey, thanks so much for being with us. Where can our viewers connect with you on social media?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter @RobertGerke, or read my material at sltrib.com.
All right, good to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thanks, Glenn.
Still to come, the Utah Attorney General suspends the use of a controversial surveillance system after serious questions arise about the owner of the company's past. Our panel will weigh in. But first, grocery store workers are being hailed as heroes for risking their safety to keep store shelves stocked. Now the federal government is looking to reward them. Find out how after the break. Welcome back. Lawmakers in the U.S. House and Senate are trying to protect consumers from scammers and price gouging in light of the coronavirus pandemic. They say it's time to stop those playing on the public sphere for profit. Joe Khalil reports from Washington.
$30 toilet paper, $70 hand sanitizer.
We see amazing markups of common items that many people need.
Some online sellers have been price gouging, trying to profit off Americans' coronavirus fears. Congressman Ted Lieu is one of a group of lawmakers who've introduced a bill to end price gouging during national emergencies.
Prior crises usually affected certain regions of the country. This is affecting all of America.
That it not only allows enforcement actions, but by having this in place, we will raise knowledge on the consumer side so that people know what their rights are.
Senator Kamala Harris says the law would prohibit businesses or private sellers from marking up items beyond 10% of their regular market price during any national emergency.
We will not only require enforcement by the FTC, but we will also give the enforcement ability to state AGs.
While the bill aims to prevent price gouging and punish those who do it, consumer advocates say it's a hard thing to police on a national scale.
The degree of fraud that I anticipate will be happening over the coming months is so great.
Ira Reingold is the director of the National Association of Consumer Advocates. He says laws may help, but the incentive to raise prices is still high.
Folks are going to take the risk of making huge profits and committing fraud as opposed to sort of the small chance that they'll actually get caught.
He says it'll take vigilant enforcement at the local, state, and national levels to stop the price gougers. In Washington, I'm Joe Khalil.
When you think of the heroes of the pandemic, most would think of the healthcare workers on the front line. But lawmakers say grocery store workers are too often forgotten. Washington correspondent Basil John reports on a bill to say thank you to those workers.
Lawmakers say they want to help some of our heroes on the front lines.
And that's the hardworking men and women that work in our grocery stores and our convenience stores.
Pennsylvania Representative Glenn G.T. Thompson has introduced the Grocer Act, which would provide a bonus to food supply workers who make less than $75,000.
This really is a proposal to provide a federal tax holiday for them, to where for a period of time, February 15th to June 15th, those the hours that they would work during this crisis, they wouldn't pay federal income tax.
Pennsylvania Democrat Dwight Evans co-signed the bill and agrees grocery store workers are critically important to all of us.
Part of the army of the frontline workers. The grocery food workers are very essential to what takes place in terms of our food and the access of food.
Representative Thompson says the idea comes from a system used for those who serve time in the military overseas, and that these food supply employees are fighting their own battle.
That can impact the morale of these folks who are performing a life essential function.
And both lawmakers say without those workers, many Americans would struggle.
Food is medicine. Food deals with our hunger. Food contributes to all of us.
The bill also asks the Treasury Department to extend this benefit for an additional 3 months if the coronavirus crisis continues beyond June 15th. Reporting in Washington, I'm Basil John.
Still to come, both of the major political parties in Utah are claiming success after hosting virtual state conventions for the first time ever. Will that be the new norm moving forward? Our panel weighs in after the break.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now to dig into some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Representatives Andrew Stoddard and Corey Malloy. Gentlemen, great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
Let's get right into it. One of the big stories breaking through the week was the suspension of banjo. This has been really a controversial topic for quite a while now, at least going back to the last year. So it was revealed that the owner, Damian Panton, had ties as a teenager with the KKK. But again, this is something that people were really looking into before that. So Representative Stoddard, let's start with you. Your thoughts on the latest developments?
Thanks. It's something that is long overdue, in my opinion. This is a company that's operated with zero transparency. We're not sure exactly all that it does, how it operates, what purpose it serves. And there's a lot of taxpayer money on every level that has gone into this. So I think it's the right call based on the owner's past, but I think it's something that should have been done a long time ago.
Representative Malloy, some of your colleagues on the Republican side were looking at running new bills in the upcoming session to try to address this very issue. Your thoughts on banjo?
Well, I think it's the right call to do for multiple reasons. I think, the data collection that goes on with this program that they're doing is a phenomenal amount of data from a lot of different sources. And my biggest concern would be how it relates to privacy and how the data will actually be used. I understand that the Attorney General's office wants to try and do what they can to speed up prosecutions when they're justified and stuff, but it's just so questionable how this data can be used. So my biggest concern would be privacy. Not having heard of this gentleman's background, that's also very concerning. So it's come out this week, and so it's definitely the right thing to do to discontinue using this service.
All right, a question I want both of you to weigh in on is there a place for artificial intelligence or this type of banjo technology in law enforcement in the future? Representative Stoddard, let's go back to you. You work as a prosecutor with Murray City, so do you see any value in this type of technology when we're talking about law enforcement?
I don't think we're there quite yet. I think law enforcement and technology have a lot of benefits when they work together, but I think things are coming out at such a new rate that we're not sure how they interact with civil liberties. We're not sure if there are biases that are built into these AI algorithms. And so I think there may be a place for it, but there's a lot of work we have to do until we get to a point that we can successfully use it and defend using it.
Okay, Representative Malloy, do you see any future for this type of technology in law enforcement?
Well, I would have to agree with my colleague that there's probably a place for it, but I'm not an expert on AI by any means. But what I do understand about it is it could do a lot of good things, but I think we have to proceed very, very carefully, especially as it relates to protecting the privacy and the rights of our people here in the state of Utah.
All right, let's move on to the virtual state conventions. We had those, and both parties, the chairs of both parties, were really excited about the success of that and the participation. You guys are both state delegates. Give us your rundown of how you thought the process went. Representative Malloy, let's start with you on this one.
I thought it was phenomenal. When we first heard that we were going to cancel the caucus meetings and then the convention, it was just, how are we going to do this? We just cannot let our election process stop. And I think the chairman, Derek Brown, for the Republican Party did a great job, he and his team, putting together a phenomenal convention that was done all online. And I have to say the same about my county convention down in Utah County. Same thing. It was just so quick, so smooth. It worked for everybody. The percentages of participants who voted in the conventions was, I think, if I recall correctly, it beat the records from when we had it before. I will say that it's difficult not to get out there and be able to meet with the candidates and rub shoulders with all of our friends and neighbors who go to the convention. That's probably the hardest part, but
Okay, yeah, we'll get into that in a little bit because I want to bring Representative Stoddard up first, but then I want to get into, is this the way of the future? Representative Stoddard, though, before we get to that, your thoughts on how the virtual convention played out on the Democratic side?
I thought it went fantastically. Our county convention was done by phone, which I think was a lot of work for our county officials, but it went incredibly smoothly. And then our state convention was done by email, and both were incredibly efficient. It was nice to have the bulk of my Saturdays on those days because they were nice days to get out. But I did appreciate how quickly and smoothly the voting process was and not having to wait for recounts and things like that.
I have to say, from a media perspective, it was nice to have the bulk of my Saturday as well, no doubt about that. Okay, the next question for both of you. Is this the way of the future? And if so, what accommodations or changes need to be made to make this a permanent thing in Utah politics? Representative Malloy.
Well, I think we learned a lot and did some things that we didn't know that could be done. And so I think a lot of these bits and pieces will move forward, and how they will be done, I'm not exactly sure. But I think, to me, it would be a hybrid or a mix of the traditional with the technology. That's what I would love to see, you know, being able to get out and visit with the candidates. Like I said earlier, rubbing shoulders with my friends and neighbors, talking about the candidates, and then, you know, perhaps getting online and doing the vote that way, or even doing it from home. But I'm not sure what that would look like, but I see us doing probably a combination, and it was a great learning experience.
Representative Stoddard, what is the wave of the future when it comes to virtual conventions?
Yeah, and I think Representative Malloy is exactly right. There are certain social aspects as well as the ability to hear candidates speak against each other, so you can compare their ideas and their platforms in real time, that we need to figure out how to be able to integrate that into the virtual voting. But I absolutely hope that the electronic voting stays.
Okay, let's move into another big story of the week, and that is the shift to the stabilization stage when we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, reopening businesses in a careful way. Representative Stoddard, we'll start with you on this one. Is now the time to begin doing that?
You know, I'm a different kind of doctor. I'm a lawyer, and so I can't claim to fully comprehend the data, but in listening to the press conferences from people who are a lot smarter than me, specifically Dr. Dunn, it sounds like she's been very encouraged with the data and how we're doing in terms of flattening the curve, and I appreciate that. I've firsthand witnessed the economic damage that has been done as a result, but I think it was the right call to shut things down. I do think with some strict precautions that things can start to open up, but what I don't want to see is it get taken advantage of, and then we're right back where we started, where everything has to shut down again.
Okay, Representative Malloy, I want to hit on one specific thing Representative Stoddard said there, and it was, he says it was the right decision to shut everything down. Do you believe that?
For me, it's hard to say. I think we definitely, as a society, had to address the pandemic and the virus. And but to me, I think as we move into these different stages, I think it is the right time to move to the next stage. We have to get our economy moving again. We still have to be very conscientious about our health as a society and protecting ourselves as well as protecting others. But I think there's a combination of common sense that as a society, as people living in this society, that we all naturally take the right precautions and start getting our government a little bit more out of it without doing anything that would certainly spike and increase the return of the virus.
We have 1 minute left. I want to get both of your thoughts on this, what we saw play out, the dynamic between local leaders and state leaders. We saw mayors Jenny Wilson and Aaron Mendenhall disagree with the governor and kind of go in their different ways, but they did so still working together. Your thoughts on how that all came together? Representative Stoddard.
I think the way that our state and local leaders interacted was fantastic. I think the governor in his plan left open that different locales could address things differently for their needs. And I think that's what's going to play out now is you'll see Salt Lake County still have more strict standards than different parts of the state. And And I think on the local level, they are more prepared to address that because they're right there.
Okay, Representative Moy, you'll have the last 30 seconds. You live in a county that did not go to an order but kept it as a directive. Do you like how your local leaders handled it in your area?
I do. I think our county leaders and our mayors in the towns in Utah County did a phenomenal job without getting too strict and letting that common sense among our people kind of run the show. Most people were doing everything they were supposed to keep themselves and their families safe, while also being responsible not to do anything that would harm anybody else. And I think the data reflects that. And I kind of hesitate to make things too strict.
All right, we're going to have to end it on that note. Great conversation. Appreciate having both of you here. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. The primary election is coming up next month, and it will be conducted mostly by mail due to the coronavirus. So watch for your ballots to arrive at your home the week of June 9th. The voter registration deadline is June 19th, and Election Day is Tuesday, June 30th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com, or you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Just log on and search Glenn Mills ABC4. Thanks so much for making us part of your day. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.